Hi everyone, the EcoLab webinar will begin very soon. Please sit back and relax for the time being. Hi everyone, the EcoLab webinar series will begin very soon. Please kindly sit back and relax for the time being. Hi everyone, welcome to the EcoLab webinar series. Thank you for joining us for the EcoLab webinar series. My name is Ryan Jin and I'm leading the effort in Smart Cities and Future Mobility at EcoLab's Center of Innovation for Energy, or EcoLabs for short. I'll be hosting today's session. EcoLabs, jointly established by Nanyang Technological University, Enterprise Singapore, and Sustainable Energy Association Singapore, SEAS, aim to build and accelerate deep tech energy innovation capabilities in Singapore to support the nation's future energy transition. This joint initiative aims to help Singapore-based energy startups and SME successfully commercialize and scale their innovation efforts by providing them with the following: translational research, living test beds, innovation programs, funding partners, and community platform. As the COVID situation is going on, we are organizing the EcoLabs webinar series to continue the engagement and interaction with our partners, where we invite industry experts to offer their insights on respective topics with me. This webinar series comprises of 5 themes: Startup Series, Insight Series, Corporate Series, Investor Series, and EcoLab Series, each focusing on different aspects of the innovation ecosystem. This series is part of EcoLab's Insight webinar series to provide industrial insight to understand and navigate the innovation journey in the energy sector. You'll also learn about the different aspects of the startup ecosystem, market analysis, and what to look out for and where are the different opportunities. Today's webinar is part of a partnership between EcoLabs and Cleantech Group, where Cleantech Group provides targeted market briefings supported by active outreach to engage prioritized market participants in the ecosystem. Based in the US with global reach, Cleantech Group provides research, consulting, and events to catalyze opportunities for sustainable growth powered by innovations. Today's webinar titled, "What will it take to reach the goal of zero carbon electricity generation?" presented by Mr. Louis Brasington, is the head of energy research at Cleantech Group. He will highlight 3 areas of early-stage innovation: renewable energy procurement, long-duration energy storage, and smart buildings. For each of these areas, he will provide a snapshot of the innovation ecosystem, diving into the various business activities, opportunities, highlighting the example of startups. Louis' expertise is focused on analysis, data and research, and business development around sustainable innovations in the energy system, providing insights on the changing roles of energy companies and consumers, and the uptake of new energy technologies. Towards the end of each session, we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can key in your question in the Q&A icon right below in your control panel, or raise your hand so that we can unmute you to voice your question during the interaction session. Now, without further ado, we would like to pass the session to Mr. Louis Brasington, Head of Energy Research at Cleantech Group. Louis, please.
Great. Thank you, Ryan, for that very warm introduction, and good afternoon to many of you, and happy Friday. As Ryan said, my name is Louis Brasington. I'm the Head of Energy and Power Research at Cleantech Group. Very excited to be here and to share some of the insights that we've been looking at over the last few months. So I'm just going to share my screen. Ryan, do you mind just giving me rights to share the screen? That'd be great.
You should be able to share screen now.
Great, thank you very much. Let's just share this. Bear with me, everyone. And Ryan, just let me know when you can see the full screen.
I'm looking at your PowerPoint slide. It's full screen now.
Great, fantastic. So yeah, welcome everyone, and thanks for taking your time today. I really appreciate it. So just to quickly give you a brief introduction to Cleantech Group, I know Ryan quickly touched on that, but Cleantech Group aims to touch on some of the trends, companies, and keep you in touch with the people that help shape a more digitized, decarbonized, and resource efficient industrial future. So our core focus is on the innovation side of the market, and we help that by looking at the business models and technology via providing research, consulting services, and events. The areas that we look at across different areas of the clean tech landscape include agriculture and food, energy and power, materials and chemicals, resource and environment, and transportation logistics. And we also look at what the innovative enabling technologies, business models and themes are which span across those sectors. So as Ryan alluded to, today I'm going to be going through a few areas that we think are really hot at the moment in the energy sector when it comes to early stage innovation. I'll be quickly providing an overview of some of the key trends in clean tech. We'll then be looking at corporate renewable energy procurement and how aspects of innovation like traceability are driving this trend. We'll then have a quick look at long duration energy storage, seeing how and why there's an increasing need for long duration storage in the market globally today. And lastly, we'll be finishing off by looking at decarbonized buildings, looking at the potential for buildings to decarbonize around 28% of global energy related CO2 emissions. And of course, at the end, I'll be happy to open up to Q&A and we can dive into any particular slides or topics of any of your choosing. So yeah, please use the chat box as much as possible and make the most of our time. So let's kick it off. So corporate renewable energy procurement is after the overview. So this is the clean tech investment landscape as we see it today. The clean tech innovation market has come a long way, certainly since 2010. Investments have actually surged above 35 billion in 2019 and have maintained 5-year growth. Last year, as more late stage investment increased, the number of early round sizes decreased slightly year on year from 2018. However, we're seeing this trend continue into 2020. Of course, the impact of COVID-19 will have some delays to some deals being made, but all in all, we're seeing early stage innovation being made by a lot of venture capitalists, and that's very progressive. So back in 2013-14, when what we like to call the first clean tech boom, we had the rise of some pure play clean tech venture capital funds. That dropped off significantly in 2015, and I'm pleased to say we're seeing that number going up and up again. So last year alone, we saw a huge amount of funds closing, specifically focused on investing in clean technology. And we're obviously just part of the way into 2020, but we've already heard some good news already, despite some of the COVID-19 related slowdowns. So here are some of the subsectors our analysts are seeing as ultimately net gainers from the COVID 2019 crisis. Obviously, there's a huge amount of negativity going around, but on the innovation side of the market, we've seen key aspects of each of these industries doing very well, and we see them as having a lot of opportunity down the line. Agriculture and food, we're seeing technologies such as indoor farming, packaging innovation, farming automation, and direct-to-consumer business models of food delivery having some big potential. In energy efficiency, we're seeing areas such as buildings, retrofits, and data centers and certain aspects of the building being able to benefit as consumer patterns change. Energy storage is obviously a big one to increase energy system resiliency, and then other aspects of controlling the grid better. So things like grid flexibility, demand response, and things like microgrids to help increase resiliency. The final area that we've noted here for energy and power is traceability and transparency. How well do you know where your energy is coming from? How well do you know where the customer supply chain is and how things are flowing through? And can you guarantee that green energy is actually green? Just quickly touching on the other areas, we're seeing 3D printing as a great way for companies to pivot and support some of the challenges going on with manufacturing ventilators during the COVID-19 crisis. And we're seeing a lot of innovators being able to provide support there. When it comes to resource and environment, it's all around domestic water purification, indoor air pollution and air quality monitoring, and carbon capture, utilization and storage. On the transportation logistics side, last mile delivery solutions, micro-mobility and supply chain optimization, key areas we're seeing as long-term winners due to COVID-19. Obviously, a lot of people are traveling less. So, the short story there is transport has been impacted, but we're seeing further optimizations needed to be able to cater for these kind of downturns in the future. And that's what we're seeing happening. And on the enabling technology side, we're seeing some areas like automation, remote monitoring, control, cybersecurity, geospatial, AR, VR, and 5G as instrumental to the future. So that's a quick overview of the clean tech market today. We're now going to dive into corporate renewable energy procurement. So corporate new energy procurement, people buying, developing and installing new energy. Corporates are a key part of the energy landscape. And I wanted to give you a quick history as to where the market is today and where it's come from. So back in 2005, most corporates purchased energy attribution certificates for generic pools. Ultimately, the aim here was to support the green image, but in a lot of countries, the price demand dropped to premium cost, volatility, and short length. In the mid-2010s and around 2015, you saw the PPA model taking launch, which helped mitigate the price of long-term fixed energy contracts and helped hedge against volatility and electricity costs. This was really great for some corporates as it supported their additionality claims, meaning it supported their claims to say that they have added X amount of renewables to the grid on a yearly basis. This was fantastic. However, the current methods around annual PPA accounting more or less lack consideration of periods of over and under supply. Most corporates do their accounting on an annual basis for emissions. So they're actually going to be significantly overstating the energy savings if there's a considerable amount of peaks and troughs on a daily and weekly basis. So that's a bit of an issue and something that needs to be solved. So what we're seeing towards 2020 by a small handful of players and beyond is corporates ultimately looking to support energy procurements which help maximize positive emissions and impact of their investments. So we're seeing corporates wanting to claim, prove, and communicate they can help add new renewables to the same grids where they physically consumed electricity based on their actual energy consumption. And we're seeing a few innovations and pilots going on in that space. So the transition from 2005 was green image, and now we're looking at people looking to have a sustained impact and reduce risk. And there's only a few players looking at this at the moment. It's a very small market. People like Google, Daimler, and Microsoft have active pilots and projects going on. And we're thinking in the next few years, we're going to see the next 1 to 200 renewable energy 100 buyers, corporates actively looking at additionality today to much more consider proof of impact and how they're looking at emissionality in the long term. So this is a value chain showing you some of the players, innovators supporting this new innovation going on in the energy market. And you've seen highlighted around the orange dotted box, some of the innovators here. So you might recognize a few of these if any of you are knowledgeable about the energy market, but a few of them are active in Singapore, some are active in Europe, some US, some global. We've also highlighted some other areas of the value chains, which are really interesting, not related to traceability, but obviously a key aspect of the energy landscape in and of itself. So we'll go into a few more examples a little bit later, but this is just highlighting some of the innovation landscape going on in the market today. This is highlighting some of the recent projects going on globally. And I think there's some really exciting ones to note here that have just come around in the last few months or so. Most locally for EcoLabs is the SP Group project going on with Energy Web Foundation. So since 2016, SP Group has been operating an international REC marketplace and or actually became the local IREC issuer in combination with EWF, who is providing the technology for traceability in the local market. You're also seeing in Thailand, PTT launching their own IREC marketplace, which is due for launch in the next couple of months, again with technology provider Energy Web Foundation, which is another interesting project. So there's a lot going on in the international REC certificate market. And in the other parts of the world, you're seeing really interesting innovation going on too. In Europe, you're seeing players like FlexiDAO really helping a lot of the corporates and utilities with some of their traceability and procurement. And then even in the US, you're seeing players like PowerLedger and Energy Web Foundation once again helping large corporates like Google, Microsoft, and Clearway Energy with some of their traceability needs. Here's just an example of some of the players that we've spoken to and are actively engaging and innovating in the market. FlexiDAO is a provider of software as a service solutions for retailers, utilities, and corporate buyers, and helps them automatically trace energy attribute data. They've been targeting integrated utilities with a retail offering a package to corporates alongside a green tariff as a value-added service, which provides additional traceability insights to corporate buyers. The other player we mentioned here is Energy Web Foundation. So they're an organization which is membership-based, and they provide an open source blockchain platform to their solutions to their corporate affiliates, which is now over 100 people. They're largely focused on helping corporates develop these PPA marketplaces and also these IREC marketplaces. And we gave some of those examples on the last slide, but they're actively involved in a range of projects globally. The final company who some of you may have heard of is PowerLedger. PowerLedger develops ledger-based products, which are largely in pilot stage around the world, and they're helping with transactive energy, helping with trading environmental commodities and investing in renewables. They have a range of projects and products, but the most interesting couple here to note is their new Vision product, which allows traceability and certification of energy attribute certificates to allow customers to guarantee and know where their energy came from. So they're an interesting company, and they have a range of different pilots, including peer-to-peer energy trading around the world today. So that was a quick highlight on some of the innovations we're seeing on renewable energy procurement. I'm now going to highlight some innovation we're seeing today in long duration energy storage. And we're going to be visiting the overview of the market. And then we're also going to be briefly touching on the hydrogen market, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard a lot of in the last couple of years. So why are we talking about long duration storage? Why do we need it? So as the market increases the penetration of renewables, we're seeing a need for low cost, adaptable, and carbon-free long duration storage. Today, intraday and intraday balancing needs are typically met with carbon-based power plants, whether that's a gas peaker plant or a coal facility, or even a hydropower facility. However, 2018 was the first year we saw where the number of carbon-based operating peaker plants closed. Pumped hydro obviously remains the largest source for large-scale long-duration storage. It actually accounts for 96% of global energy storage today in the market. However, new projects are finding issues with siting, environmental, and obviously high cost. On the other side of the market, the lithium-ion market is exploding. It's great. However, it's only really viable in relatively short duration applications where revenue can ultimately be stacked and adapted to market pricing. However, the lithium-ion battery market becomes a lot less economical when you're looking at very large scale compared to, say, a hydropower plant. And we've estimated that lithium-ion actually costs around 5 times more per megawatt shifted than its short duration when you're trying to do it in these long duration applications. So there's a need here in the market for some new technology. This is a graph that we put together showing you some of the innovators actively looking at different technologies. The y-axis shows the maximum discharge duration of these solutions, and the x-axis shows the max power rating of these solutions. And you'll see some familiar faces, hopefully. On the electrochemical battery market, where most EVs are active, you're seeing players doing very well and receiving a lot of money. 8.2 billion venture capital has actually been invested into these players in the last 10 years. These players are fantastic and they're doing very well for maximum amount of hours discharge. However, if you're looking to very long duration energy storage, you need to start considering other things. So if you're looking to do seasonal balancing, then something like thermal energy storage could be a good option. If you're looking to do low cost bulk power management, then some of the innovators working on mechanical based storage might be interesting. Lastly, obviously, chemicals energy storage is a little bit of a different beast, but we've highlighted it here as something around very long duration energy storage. And you'll see a lot of the hydrogen storage players here, some of the players doing green ammonia, methanol, and such. And we'll touch a little bit on that in a bit more detail later. This is the technology landscape for long duration energy storage as we see it today. And you'll see some players from the last slide, but this really breaks up where the long duration market is. So on the electrochemical side, you're seeing a bunch of players developing different flow-based solutions. On the thermal side, people either go for sensible heat or latent heat storage solutions. The mechanical is a big mix of novel-based solutions, but it usually takes learnings from different markets like oil and gas, pump hydro, adapts them and makes it low cost and easy to store energy as possible. On the chemical side, as mentioned, a lot of innovation is going on hydrogen. Ammonia is an early market, methane, methanol, and thermochemical storage, areas that we've highlighted as areas of interesting innovation. But where do the markets exist today? Most players today only in storing need for short duration balancing. There's only a small portion of the market which actually needs anything beyond 4 hours of energy storage duration on a maximum discharge. So many players are seeing this market is 5 to 10 years away. And for many parts of the world, that is true. However, there are some examples we're seeing today where that's actually changing today and innovators can add value straight away. So the main value factors for deciding where those places are: energy storage regulation, looking at the renewable penetration in that market, looking at things like the off-grid peak pricing, the cost of natural gas, the policies, and looking at how much it costs to upgrade transmission and interconnectors. So looking at all of those, you can actually see that the two areas that we've highlighted here, California and Australia, are two really interesting areas. Australia, for example, has a very high penetration of renewables. A lot of their energy comes from solar. They're also experiencing a lot of issues with negative wholesale pricing due to having too much renewable electricity on the grid. And there was actually a time where Queensland reached minus 1,000 megawatts, dollars per megawatt in Q3 last year, causing a lot of the solar plants to turn off. There is a lot of work going on installing lithium-ion batteries. However, there's a huge amount of planned closures for coal plants happening in the next few years. And there's going to be a big gap in this long duration peaker plant storage, which is ultimately going to have to be served by other solutions. And we spoke to a few players who are looking to be active there. There's a lot of international players who are looking to move there. And there's a lot of players who are actually local to Australia and are looking to increase their finance. Moving on to the other side, hydrogen is obviously a big market and everyone's talking about it at the moment, and they have been. We've had lots of client projects on it recently. Today, there's a 70 million ton demand for hydrogen used annually. That's mainly for chemicals, for refining, for annealing, blanketing and forming gas in the iron and steel sector, and for sectors like non-metallics, electronics and food. So that's 99% of the market, and the existing use is around 8 exajoules as of 2015. However, looking at some of the long-term projections, we're seeing that projected use could increase by about tenfold, and those existing users will actually go down to around 30%. What we're then going to see is a new field of demand coming on, mainly from fuel cell buildings, industrial heat and power. So that's your commercial buildings and your big industrial buildings. Also for transportation. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of some of the interesting projects going on in China and other parts of the world, but a lot of the innovation there is going on the heavy duty vehicle side. And then also the other areas we're seeing an increased demand is things like hydrogen combustion for power. So directly using hydrogen in gas turbine generators as a peaker plant alternative. And then also for new feedstocks. This is another value chain, and don't worry, we can't take it all in now. We'll be sending these slides to you afterwards. But this is how the innovation landscape is building out today. So on the hydrogen generation side, you're seeing people develop novel electrolyzers, which can use renewable energy to generate hydrogen cleanly. On the hydrogen storage side, you see people looking at solid state hydrogen storage as a way to increase the density of hydrogen storage and maybe transport it in a safer way. On the processing side, you're seeing people ultimately trying to get some of the inefficiencies around decompression, compression, and purification sorted out. That's still a large issue with hydrogen today and something that a lot of people are trying to solve. And finally, on the distribution side, you're seeing people building out hydrogen infrastructure. So Germany's got some really exciting pipeline infrastructure projects. UK has announced some projects going on, and I think other parts of Asia Pacific also have some exciting projects lined up. So these are some of the innovators working in that space. And here's some of the innovators I quickly wanted to highlight to you. Quidnet Energy is a startup which is a developer of geomechanical pumped hydro energy storage systems. They've actually raised 8 million now in capital from investors such as Breakthrough Energy Ventures, EVOC, and the US Department of Energy. They've had a range of really exciting projects recently. They recently closed 2 1 to 10 megawatt hour projects, and it's a very interesting solution. They're looking to take aspects of the oil and gas sector to generate a low cost solution where they can pump water underground and then displace it as a long duration storage mechanism. And they're aiming to reach $2 to $5 per kilowatt hour to be competitive. The current pilot's around $20. H2 Store is an Australian company developing a metal alloy hydride storage material. These players are trying to focus on the residential and light commercial market by compressing hydrogen in a solid state material to be transported and used safely. So you're not worried about having it right next to a residential building. They're very early stage in pilot, but they talked about some really exciting technologies and their efficiencies are quite exciting. Another player I wanted to mention here was GRZ Technologies. GRZ are a developer of a porous material for hydrogen storage. In a similar way, they're developing technology to suit the same needs as H2 Store. However, they're looking at other applications such as transportation. They recently raised some money from Hyundai, who actually has a 100 million hydrogen energy fund, and they're looking to target utilities providing peak power, daily storage, and long-term storage. At the end of this year, they're looking to have their first pilot project operational. Lastly, the final company I wanted to mention was more on the thermal energy storage side. Axiom Energy has been around for a while, but they've recently pivoted, providing an energy management system for refrigeration batteries. Ultimately, what they're doing is working with grocery stores like Whole Foods in the US, converting their refrigerators and freezers into cold storage assets, which then can be turned up and down a temperature or two to provide demand response to the grid. And they've recently had a really exciting partnership with a demand response aggregator called Leap, where they're allowing Whole Foods to unlock grid services and to be able to gain revenue for grid services in the grid. So 4 very different technologies, all in different active markets of long duration storage, but ones we think you guys should be listening and paying attention to. The final area that I wanted to touch on before we finish up for Q&A are buildings. There's a lot going on in buildings, and when people talk about buildings, especially to an energy analyst, they normally start talking about energy management, operation and maintenance. However, that's just one part of the story. Buildings, when we look at buildings, we look at everything from the procurement, the use of materials, how sustainable the materials you're using are, all the way down to how innovative the demolition and management of the end of life of a building is. Of course, there's all the energy related aspects of that, anything from EVs, digitization, grid integration, and on-site energy storage are all key aspects. But the buildings market has huge amount of potential to decrease global CO2 emissions. Actually, buildings today presents an opportunity to decarbonize 28% of global energy related CO2 emissions. This graph on the right shows in 2018 what the energy use was in some commercial buildings and what the projected use is in 2050. The other uses includes electronic equipment, including rechargeable equipment, security systems, and non-essential loads. Think about plugging your phone in. So today we're seeing increasing energy demand, and despite a 2013 inflection, buildings are using more energy than ever. As I said, there's a potential to decarbonize 28% of global emissions, and actually the peaks have been coming up recently due to extreme weather, increasing heating and cooling demand, and a growing electricity use. Obviously, we're seeing an increasing energy intensity also in emerging economies. So players in areas like Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia are really ramping demand for cooling and is the fastest growing end use in buildings today. We're also seeing an interesting trend in the convergence of energy and operational innovation. By that, we mean people developing energy management for buildings and then people developing facility management innovation for buildings. People are actually starting to value those together, and we're seeing innovations such as indoor space sensing, air quality, worker productivity as key drivers today, and really showing us how some of the innovation is moving is to look at some of their activities. The other key thing I want to mention here is the varying pace of innovation. Upstream of the value chain, there's a lot slower technology adoption. So while upstream, I mean the people early in the construction market doing design, deployment of buildings. Where you're seeing a lot of the innovation is in operation and maintenance and building energy management. However, the whole industry is pretty fragmented. By that, I mean you have a lot of different players not really talking and working together as best as they could. There's a lack of vertical integration across the whole building supply chain, and that sometimes causes discrepancies and issues when trying to adopt innovation. Again, another busy slide, but be more than happy to talk through some of these examples at a later stage, if so be. Obviously, at the top of the value chain, we have design, engineering, and materials. Some of the players looking at biomaterials, sustainable cement, and other smart materials as a way to decrease the embedded CO2 in a building. There's innovation going around in equipment and construction services, and people looking at things like dynamic high-performance glass, people looking at construction robotics and 3D printing and analytics as a way to optimize the design and construction process. On the other side, distributed energy is obviously a core part of what buildings are today. And increasingly, people are referring as buildings to grid edge assets, just another energy asset to be optimized. And you're seeing interesting innovation going on that side, anywhere from an on-site microgrid, an on-site energy storage asset, hydrogen and fuel cells, people enabling the integration of assets in the building to participate in grid services. Of course, in asset operations and management, there's a lot going on. We have a lot of people looking at predictive analytics, people who are doing prescriptive command and control to optimize dynamically how buildings are performing and operating. We're seeing people doing occupancy spacing, looking at how productive workers are and how we can optimize a workspace to have more efficiency. People obviously looking at indoor environmentalism, people having really interesting business models like energy efficiency, where they're charging zero capex up front and offering a long-term service agreement to ultimately decrease the barrier of entry for installation of some of the equipment needed. Other areas to quickly mention here are geospatial, parking tracking, facility management, and utility energy management. And of course, the building supply chain wouldn't be complete without mentioning demolition and waste management. There's innovation going on with the waste removal marketplaces. There's obviously innovation also going on with energy recovery, people capturing waste heat and reusing it as a power generation asset. And there's also innovation going on with waste recycling and reuse. These are some of the innovators I wanted to quickly walk you through. VergeSense is a developer of AI-powered occupancy sensing solutions for facility management. They're a US-based company, and their main platform connects with vision sensors and processes real-time workspace utilization data. They have customers in the commercial market, buildings in the Fortune 500 range, and they work with players such as hospitals and retail. The sensor software package is very interesting because it allows heat mapping and allows you to see where workers are most active and where you could change layouts of buildings to optimize comfort, efficiency, productivity, and ultimately value of the building. Grid Edge is a UK-based company who recently received some interesting strategic capital from BP Ventures and Goldacre. They're a developer of predictive energy management analytics software, and they're looking at using AI to predict, optimize, and control a building's energy demand. The interesting thing about them is it's not a complex solution that people need to understand how to use. I know a lot of facility managers are very annoyed when they have to yet again have to learn how to use another piece of complex tech. This system integrates very easily with existing building energy management solutions and metering systems, and can enable proactive control where the commercial market seems ready. So if your facility managers are ready to give more control to the AI, then that's fine. If not, that's fine too. Grid Edge will allow people to take their own control. The final two innovators I wanted to mention, Carbon Lighthouse is a US provider of actively managed energy services. And the interesting innovation for them is they've developed this energy efficiency as a service business model. They do have technology and they're definitely software enabled. However, they offer a low cost, no upfront cost option to customers, which they ultimately provide the engineering services, the installation, the forecasting analysis of energy savings to their commercial building customers, and then over a period of time will take money back from the energy savings that the customer makes. To fund this, we've worked with players such as Cox and other project financiers to be able to offer this interesting financing package. And it's been very successful. And for me, this is one of the really exciting areas of innovation, because a lot of the time, you could just develop an interesting smart gadget, but it's one thing being able to develop it, and it's another thing getting the customer to pay for it and ultimately use it. But their solution allows customers to not have to pay anything for it and just reap the benefits and take a portion of their benefits to the Carbon Lighthouse for installing it in the first place. So they're an exciting company and one to keep an eye on. They're increasingly receiving more and more capital, and I think they're mainly active in North America, but worth keeping an eye on their activities globally today as they look to scale internationally. Finally, another similar company to mention here is Spark Fund. They're actually a fintechnology company who look at providing other companies with a subscription-based energy efficiency as a service model. So they basically offer a similar service to Carbon Lighthouse, however, only a component of it. They don't offer or develop the technology at all. So they partner with players like a tech provider such as Gridpoint, and then they'll work with a corporate like Shell to help enable Shell to offer their own building subscription service. So this is a really interesting trend we're seeing. Traditionally, Shell, oil and gas players, you'd never see active downstream. However, now they're becoming much closer to the customer and using things like energy efficiency as a service and other building energy management efficiencies to further interact with the customer. And I think that's only going to become more important as you see things like EVs come online and electricity load becoming a key aspect of the whole energy sector. So Spark Fund are a really interesting company, and I think they're going to be key in helping corporates with that transition. And they partner with contractors, energy service companies and manufacturers to help embed these financing options to ultimately enable energy efficiency as a service. So that's 4 companies we've highlighted in the smart buildings and buildings supply chain. And that's the end of the presentation. I know there's a lot of content there. So as Ryan said, we have some time for questions and answers now. If you would like us to jump back and visit any areas in particular, I'll be more than happy to do that. Or if you have any other questions, we're more than happy to answer those as well. But thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you, Louis, for your sharing. It's really a very insightful sharing that we have. I understand that that there are some questions for you already in the Q&A box. There's a question from Parashit Kukani. Would you like to speak? If you like to ask a question live, you can actually click the raise hand button and we can allow you to talk. All right, so you can unmute yourself to ask the question. So for others who like to ask questions, you can actually raise hand and we will cue you to ask your questions. Sorry, go ahead.
Hi, Ryan and Louis. It was a fantastic presentation, very comprehensive. Thanks for that. My question is actually referring to mode of transportation for H2, which is now being quite talked about. And I'm from Jurong Port, so we are also into some of the research that is happening in H2 as well. So we are aligning with overall national directions for H2 as well. But what I wanted to understand is, has there been any research done on the progress of transporting hydrogen in various parts of the world, from from places like Australia, where you have green H2 available? Because there are some companies from Australia which are really reaching out worldwide to send in their green H2. But the medium of it, which then affects the infrastructure on the receiving side, is still being talked about. So I just wanted to know if is there any so-called sharing on that in terms of how transport is happening for H2? Thanks.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thank you. And that's a fantastic question and something that we get asked quite a lot, actually. Transportation of hydrogen is still a key issue, especially when you're looking at cross-border and looking at oceans. Australia has been a really interesting example, and you've probably seen them announcing their hydrogen roadmaps recently, and their a government office, ARENA, has been handing out a lot of grants recently to a lot of innovators looking to scale up their production capacity of hydrogen. So they're seeing their high amount of solar on the grid as a key way to generate green hydrogen and move away from their dependence on other carbon-based fuels. So in a way to transport it, there's actually some early work going on to explore how people could convert hydrogen to green ammonia. Ammonia is an interesting alternative, as it's obviously a little bit unsafe, some of the hazardous, poisonous issues people are concerned about, but if you develop the right infrastructure for it, it can have a lot higher energy. It has 10 times the energy density than hydrogen, and it has a lot lower cost per unit weight. So that's really interesting for a high density transport solution. And actually the ammonia market is very developed. The world is absolutely dependent on fertilizer, and ammonia is the primary input for that. So we're seeing potential for the transport of hydrogen from Australia, for example, to other parts of the world which are looking to import it, Singapore being one, Japan being another, as looking at ammonia as an option. That also goes in line with some of the bunker fuel regulations which are coming in the maritime sector. So you're seeing a lot of the big shipping companies like MAN, for example, they're having to make decisions today about how they can convert their power, the generation systems, to use other alternatives. There's a lot of electricity and electric storage being considered, but people are also considering ammonia as a direct alternative. And it actually doesn't require a huge amount of modifications needed to the engine system to use ammonia. And so they're thinking, could they be cultivating an ammonia-based energy storage transport network while also using it as the power generation asset? And just to finish off, something from the maritime sector I saw recently was saying that I think it was by 2030, or it could have been 2040, the maritime sector could potentially have be dependent on 25% ammonia as a power generation asset. So I keep an eye on the ammonia market for the transportation of hydrogen. I think that's a key one to follow.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So the next questions are coming from Pashan. Pashan, you are allowed to talk. You can unmute yourself to ask the question.
Yeah, hi, Luis. Thank you for the wonderful slides and the presentation. I have two questions which may be related, maybe not. So the first question is,
acquirers. So someone like Shell, they've decreased their operational expense by around 20 to 30%, I think. And they're obviously looking to increase the resiliency of their existing assets, strengthen their existing portfolio. But then they've also recently made these renewable energy targets. So will they be looking to acquire companies to increase resiliency rather than taking alternative risks in venturable investments or investing in their own projects? That could be an option. The acquisition landscape in buildings has been very hot at the moment. There's been quite a lot of amount of consolidation going on, particularly from players like ABB, Honeywell, a lot of the automation players who are acquiring players with advanced algorithm sets and basically chipping them onto their marketplace so they have a stronger and stronger platform offering. I haven't seen that happening recently, and it will be interesting to see if that trend continues, but I think that's a core strategy. If you look at the whole building technology stack with a lot of these big corporates and acquirers, there's still a lot of spaces missing. And I think that's only going to have to be solved by some of the players and the innovators being acquired. But yeah, I think that's going to be an interesting thing to watch, and something that we're going to be keeping an eye on.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we have another question from Chris. Chris, you're allowed to talk. You can unmute yourself and voice your question.
Okay, thank you. Lewis, I worked for an energy efficiency technology company, and we feel like we're kind of the unwanted child in the family, where renewable tends to get the lion's share of attention in the media and in terms of, you know, case studies and all that. Do you see that changing over time? I know just your comments about energy efficiency as a service, which could be kind of a game changer in getting funding for these projects, where in the past, you know, we're always battling with facilities people who have very little power within organizations to get capital. So do you see kind of positive signs going forward on the energy efficiency side?
Yeah, no, great question. I think as a whole, the short answer is yes. You know, if you look at the UK government, for example, the big strategy is seeing that, you know, the next target is energy efficiency, and there's a lot of things to be solved there. But I think what's really interesting, and as you mentioned there, is the interesting business models which are actually being adopted to a scale, the amount of customers which can be tapped into. So typically, you know, energy efficiency, there are a lot of players, and there are many players in the market, have been focusing either on the commercial or industrial side of the market. And it's been very difficult to penetrate maybe some of the residential or like commercial buildings. However, these really interesting business models, whether they're offering energy efficiency as a service or they're partnering with other technology providers, I think it's a really interesting way to scale the deployment of these solutions. And I think that's only going to be driven and increasing demand as you see players in countries like like California, looking to hit their kind of 2030, 2040 targets. So just one example that sprung to my mind there when we're speaking about this was 75F, who you'll see on this value chain here. So they develop a software and sensor solution for dynamic HVAC control, and they also do some form of indoor environmental monitoring as well. So traditionally you'd say, oh God, you know, who wants to pay for another sensor? You know, this is just another thing that the building operator owner has to worry about. However, they recently partnered with Decarbonized, the HVAC manufacturer, and they are going through as a licensing model, accessing their broad customer set. And I think it's really going to be those broad technology partnerships where you go in through necessary requirement is going to be where you see a real form of deployment and innovation. And I think, yeah, it's the business models which can hopefully enable the technology to be deployed a lot more rapidly.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have a question from Sivan. Sivan, you are allowed to talk. You can unmute yourself and voice your questions.
Hello, hello. Louis, are you able to hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. So you had questions on hydrogen and buildings as well. So this is on the topic of energy storage. So basically, the question I have is currently, you said the lithium ion can compete within the 4-hour market. But based on my understanding, what I see is for them to be economically deployed with proper return of investment, they still need incentives. So without incentives, they cannot compete very economically with the conventional gensets or generators or peaker plants, the current cost. So when do we see them reaching parity or better or economically more favorable than the conventional generators? That is the first question. The second question is on what is actually blocking the application stacking? Is it a technical issue or is it a regulation issue, or what needs to be done to overcome the obstacles? Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you. So the obstacles are more for thermal, mechanical, and chemical, more technical, than the less proven. You know, they've had less time in the market to develop, and you know, a lot of the revenue stacking opportunities have been built out alongside policy and regulation. So in the UK, they're looking to remove the regulation which charges for energy storage loading and discharging to the grid recently. And then obviously there's been a huge push towards additional flexibility services on the grid, looking at load shedding, balancing, as well as the ancillary services. That all needs to be worked out. and it's only going to take time for those other technologies to be able to build up that proof of case. Your other question was more around the other technologies and where we're going to see the technology develop. So I think you're right. You have to look at some of the key value factors. So this slide here. So you have to look at regulation and some of the other policy in place to find where some of the early stage innovators could participate. And you're seeing players like Highview, for example, or QuidNet, really looking strategically at places in the market where they could benefit from subsidy packages, grants, and participate with some kind of financial support in the market. Because like any clean technology, it's usually expensive and not very great at the start, but once you get to the nth product, then it becomes much more economical. So I think that's only going to grow with economies of scale, and it's going to take a number of years for these technologies to develop. You know, there's a few questions to me around some of the more outlandish technologies. Energy Vault, for example, I'm not sure if any of you have heard of them, but they are developing composite concrete brick towers, which uses gravity storage. So they basically have cranes which pull bricks up and down continuously up onto a tower and take them off to slowly release power. So I think, you know, some of these technologies are going to take a while. There's going to be a lot of capital needed, but
in particular, lithium ion batteries, that technology in particular, when do we think can be more economically feasible than conventional gensets?
So which battery was that? Pemion?
Sorry?
Which battery did you mention?
Lithium ion batteries.
Oh, lithium ion.
Well, if you look at, can be more economically favorable than the conventional gensets, at least for the 4-hour period?
Yeah. No, so that's a much more kind of forefront question. There's, you know, definitely economics of scale happening today. You're seeing significant drops in cost. The challenge is, you know, a lithium-ion battery costs half the price of a car today. So there's still a lot of cost inefficiencies there. I think some of the innovators you're seeing here, players like 24M, Silla Nanotechnologies, who are helping to increase the durability and density of batteries. Players like QuantumScape are looking at solid state solutions and are actually looking to commercialize in the next 3-4 years. By the turn of the century, by the turn of 2030s, you'll see a really change in price economics. And I think you see a lot of the automotive corporates really betting on these price declines. You know, because the battery is such an expensive part of their cars, they're seeing the targets for 20% price drops by 2030 as a key part of their strategy. And if these innovators don't come to fruition, then it's going to be a big struggle. So like you'll see Silla Nanotech here, I think they've actually received about 250 million in venture capital funding now from a lot of the automotive companies. And so there's quite a big risk bet going into some of these players commercializing and helping to get some of the costs down.
Yeah, thank you, Louis.
No worries.
Right, thank you, Louis. We have maybe 2 or 3 more minutes to go. So there's one question from the audience. Would you be able to give some examples of interesting local or Asian players? Local, I'm assuming is by Singapore, or Asian player among those displayed in the sector?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's just take you over here. So I didn't put them in, unfortunately, but there's a company called Barghest Building Performance, BARGHEST, Building Performance, and they're working in Singapore with an energy efficiency as a service business model. And so similar to Carbon Lighthouse, they're actually providing an interesting financing solution which allows a broader set of customers to be tapped into. There's a bunch of other companies we've looked at. BeBright is another interesting command and control player, I think based out of Singapore as well. So they're doing a software and sensor-based package to do dynamic control of buildings. And they're an interesting player. Just quickly taking you to long duration storage, actually. You heard me talk a little bit about the Australia market there and the need. And there's a player called 1414 Degrees, who's a latent heat thermal player. And thermal is a really interesting one because if you use thermal, solar thermal, you obviously got direct connection there. But thermal can actually work directly with process heat industries. So if you can have storage technology which can hold 300-400 degrees, and you have an industry which needs 300-400 degrees as a feedstock heat, then you have a lot easier solution. You don't have to use carbon-based heaters. So 1414 degrees is an interesting innovator down in Australia, and they're active in other parts of Asia today. And just trying to think if there's anyone else in the hydrogen market here. Anapta, the last one I'll probably mention. Anapta developing ion exchange membrane hydrogen production solutions. So they're all over the place, but they have some active microgrid projects in Thailand at the moment. Their manufacturing capabilities are in Italy, and their R&Ds in Germany. But they're looking to be the first player to use hydrogen energy storage and production in the microgrid setting, in an island setting. And they have some really exciting pilots in Asia at the moment. So definitely one to keep an eye on.
All right, thank you, Luis. There are actually many more questions and hand raised for the Q&A session. I'm just wondering whether you have another 5 or 10 more minutes to share those questions, to answer those questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've got another 10 minutes.
That's great. So maybe let me give an announcement for the next webinar before we come back to the Q&A, so that those who need to leave can leave. So thank you so much to join us for today's webinar. At the end of this webinar, there will be a survey for you to give feedback to enhance our future webinar sessions. So please, to encourage you to enter the feedback, give us some of your feedback. And if you are keen to ask questions and hear the other interactions, please feel free to join us for the next few more minutes. So just some announcement before we continue. The next EcoLab webinar series, which is the EcoLabs Standby webinar series, part 2 on startup ecosystem, originally scheduled on next Monday, 25th May, will be rescheduled to June due to a scheduling issue. So the new dates will be updated very shortly. So please follow us on the EcoLabs LinkedIn page and join us live next Friday on the 29th May, 9:30 a.m. for the next EcoLab webinar series, Mobility in a Post-COVID World by Chris Robinson, Senior Analyst from the Labs Research. So for those who need to leave or you have other appointments, please stay safe and stay healthy, and thank you so much. Right, so we will come back to the Q&A for those who are interested to join. Hashan, I see that you raised your hand. Do you have another question?
Yes, unfortunately.
Oh, yes. Go ahead, no problem, no problem.
Sorry, so Luis, I work on commercializing Cleantech, so I apologize. I keep bringing you to what is happening today as compared to what's going to happen 5 years down the line in terms of technology. So the holy grail for us in the energy efficiency has been the energy efficiency as a service, called the zero capex, opex, whatever model you want to name it. Now, with the COVID scenario, you don't even know which organization is going to survive, tomorrow, with the credit risk algorithms actually going out of the window. And so are you hearing something in terms of what's going to happen? Because, it might be a very, very challenging scenario, to put your punt your money on who the next capex is, because you are not sure what's happening inside. And given the COVID scenario, the energy efficiency as a service model might have its own limitations. So what do you think on that front?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And some of the funding challenges for that business model may face difficulties in the short term. I think what you see with players like Carbon Lighthouse is their supporters are not just in for the short term; they're in for the long term, and the money that they're putting in is drawn up over a long period of time. So the hope is that they'll be able to see past this, see the opportunities that are arising from a downturn such as COVID, and actually be able to continue on financing those kind of companies to provide that business model. As I said, I think resiliency is a key part of the building supply chain today, and that's only going to get more important. So if people can capitalize on that opportunity and manage to make it through some of the financing hurdles, then they're positioned to do well. But yeah, I think there's definitely going to be, unfortunately, a few players who won't be able to finance themselves through the downturn, where others will already have the financial supporting. Another key part to this is saying, a lot of the investors we're seeing in the space, particularly in venture capital, that's where we keep an eye on, tend to be very happy to make follow-on investments in existing companies they've already backed. They're probably a bit more hesitant to invest in new ventures if they haven't got a close relationship or done a lot of their due diligence in person beforehand. But companies which already are part of a follow-on investment round series are probably going to be okay. In Europe, we're fortunate enough for a lot of the big fund rounds to close, and so there's quite a lot of dry capital still left in the venture market. But yeah, on the crediting side, I think there could be some short-term challenges there. No, you're definitely correct.
Yeah, cool. Thanks.
Right, we have questions on the floor asking about your opinions on whether there will be increasing exit for tech energy startup, and asking for your view on the valuation gaps for companies across the different geographical areas, and whether you have any insight in this space.
So, Brian, what was the first part of the question there?
What's your do you think that there will be an increasing number of exit for tech energy startup over the years?
Increasing number of assets.
Exits.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think so. It's worth keeping an eye on. We've been keeping an eye on this, and it continues to grow. And in terms of the different valuations around the world, I think it really depends on the different demand sets for each geography you're looking at. The potential for innovators working in Singapore is very different from the potential for innovators work on the same technology in China or Germany, for example. So you have to look at the localized markets they're looking to do business in, and that obviously skews the valuation. And you also have to consider things like regulation and everything as a key component of that, and how they can be evaluated.
All right, we have one question from Kukani. Would you like to voice your question?
Hi, Alois Parekh here again. Just a quick one on the lithium-ion batteries, because we've seen competing trends between lithium-ion batteries as well as the fuel cells coming up. So with the growth in the hydrogen market, disposal of batteries being a challenge for lithium-ion, how is it being planned by companies who are innovating on the lithium-ion sector? And in terms of cost for these disposal recycling, how would it paint a picture in terms of in probably another 10 years time? Because a lot of landscape in terms of vehicles, like be it cars, be it major mobility sectors, or even in terms of industrial equipment like forklifts. A lot of forklifts are now already going on to fuel cells, which are clean. And here we are still talking about lithium-ion. So I just wanted to know how these companies who are now still investing in lithium-ion are planning for the future. Thanks.
Yeah, no. So second life batteries is one of those areas which is constantly being developed, and still today most parts of batteries and most batteries are still not recycled. There's a lot of regulation, and China recently passed some waste regulation a couple of years ago to sort a lot of this out. It's around importing, exporting waste, but from the innovation perspective, as we see it, there are some interesting opportunities going on, particularly on the EV battery side. So people can use and work with players like I can't remember their name now. There's a couple of players. Recycle is one of them. Rebattery, and there's another company which has just had a big partnership. I'll have to follow up, but basically they have the technology smarts to either extend the life of an existing battery to be used again in EV, or people are just reusing them in the stationary storage market. The cycling requirements and load requirements are sometimes a lot less harsh in the stationary settings, and obviously the buy-in cost is lower when it's almost depleted. So when you're just having it in a stationary setting, you're having the second life opportunity. And we see the second life battery market is ever so growing, and will continue to increase, particularly on that stationary storage side. Whether that continued for the fuel cell market, I'm not sure. I'm not too sure around the planning for waste on the fuel cell side, but that's yeah, something we'll have to think about. But yeah, no, you know, just to summarize there, I think end of life batteries is still has a big question for me. I think it's been solved really. I think there are 4 or 5 players who are looking to do a decent job, but it's going to take a lot of the big battery users to jump on board and actually want to recycle and spend that bit more money. And yeah, you need the technology providers to be able to offer something valuable enough for them to make that call.
Yeah, because the sustainability portion when a company is still going for green energy and using batteries and stuff, the afterlife is a big concern, because the disposal then comes back to you as well, and
Yes,
that is the portion that we are really worried about in terms of taking the next leap towards EVs. So yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think it's something everyone's thinking about, considering you're still responsible for the material, right? I think there is innovation going on. It's something that we'll have to look into. My resource and environment analyst has been looking a lot at breaking down electronics and doing electronic recycling. It's very difficult to get the high value materials. It's very costly to get the high value materials out of a battery if you're really breaking it down. So I think the second life opportunities are probably a little bit more of an easier win, but yeah, that's something to keep an eye on.
Okay, thanks.
Right, thank you so much. I think there's one last question, if you can answer it. Chris, would you like to ask your question?
I think Chris's question came up on the chat.
Yes.
Happy to answer. So in ASEAN, outside of Singapore, which countries do you think will be the most aggressive in mandating improvements in the energy efficiency within the C&I sector? I think Singapore is a great example, a lot of new builds and a lot of forward thinking, but there are players in Hong Kong who are doing a lot. Japan, we've seen a lot of innovation going on, particularly big real estate companies in areas where commercial industrial property costs per square meter are very high, have already targeted a lot of the lowest hanging fruit in terms of energy efficiency and cost savings. So I think you'll see them continue to make innovation and deployment in this kind of space. Or the other areas other areas of China where you might see complete new builds coming up, greenfield property development, having opportunity there. So, new Shenzhen smart hubs and smart city developments are obviously good pilot examples, but, for me, it's really the city states which have a high square meter cost for their C&I operations, where you're seeing people really looking for the more advanced technologies to make some of the cost savings even deeper.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah, just to follow up, my question was more on mandates, where the governments are mandating improvements across all buildings, not just new construction. So where they're requiring, like I know China's been a leader in that space, where they're very aggressive in requiring companies to improve their energy efficiency. I was curious if you saw any signs of that happening within ASEAN outside of Singapore.
No, I haven't looked at that much. We don't take a big dive into kind of the regulation side of the market. There's a few reports that we've looked at recently, Chris. I'm happy to kind of go through and follow up with you afterwards if that'd be useful.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much. It's really a very highly interactive and fruitful session that we have. Thank you, Luis, to join us and share with us, all the audience, on your insightful knowledge and experience. And thank you all the audience for joining us for today. So as we come to the end of today's sessions, I would like to wish all of you to stay healthy and stay safe in this COVID situation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you, Ryan, and thanks everyone for listening.
Bye-bye.